I'm D.L. Hudson, publisher of Crisis Magazine, and on the Church and Culture today we'll be talking to a hillbilly Thomist. Join me. Marion Montgomery is the author of over 20 published books and about 20 more that are yet to be published, including 3 novels, a novella, good poetry, short stories, many books of cultural criticism, many books of philosophy, literary criticism. He taught for over 30 years at the University of Georgia. He's lived far too many years in Crawford, Georgia. I call him the Sage of Crawford. He is here with us today, the first of 3 conversations. Marion Montgomery.
Thank you, Dave.
It's great to be with you on the Church and Culture today.
Glad to be here.
Marion, what's wrong with the world?
Well, man is fallen, deal. It happened a long time ago, and we are, of course, encountering the exaggerated consequences of that old event. So that's what's wrong with the world. So man is fallen.
So it's a plain, simple answer, Christian answer.
It seems to me that it is.
But you have gone, you wrote a trilogy 15 or so years ago entitled, a 3-part title, Why Flannery O'Connor Stayed Home, Why Poe Drank Liquor, and Why Hawthorne Was Melancholy.
Right, right.
In which you analyzed American culture in particular. What's wrong with America?
Well, it's difficult to get a starting point. Once you get the starting point, then it all unfolds. Flannery O'Connor was concerned that we began to go astray under not simply Puritanism, but a particular adaptation of Puritanism through people like Emerson. You remember she says when Emerson decided in the 1830s that he would no longer attend a service where the wine and bread were present, then things began to go to hell.
That was at Harvard.
In New England,
yes.
Yeah. And what I have contended in those books and in subsequent books is that what happens is that the Puritan reaction to orthodoxy begins to evolve into pragmatism through people like Emerson. And pragmatism comes to serve positivism. All of these have been with us since the garden, of course, but they become exacerbated in our recent history, or at least we're certainly more aware of them in our recent history. So that by the time you get to a poet like Eliot, whom Flannery was interested in, of course, he's concerned about how he has come to be isolated, and he.
So you call him a prophetic poet?
I would call him a prophetic poet. Of course, that's a term I adapt from Flannery O'Connor. She says that the prophet is not one who foretells the future. Of course, she following St. Thomas. The prophet is someone who recalls us to known but forgotten things. And of course, Eliot was struggling to recover himself to knowing the known that had been forgotten by his immediate antecedents.
And he, of course, was concerned with correcting romantic confusions of the good.
Well, he thought he was, only to discover himself a particular romantic, I think.
I might show the audience a book, if you can get a shot of this, that you recently published, entitled Romantic Confusions of the Good, Beauty as Truth, Truth as Beauty, published by Roman and Littlefield, who also published my book on happiness. And so Eliot is really one of your starting points in your journey.
Well, I think undoubtedly so, and it has been for many people. I became interested in Eliot as discovering himself lost in a dark forest the way Dante did, and trying to find his way out, and trying to find his way out on his own terms. And that's what makes him more modern than Dante. Dante recognizes relatively early that he needs help, and he's not reluctant to lean heavily on Virgil for help until he can find a surer help along his journey. Well, Eliot was. We and I were talking about his cousin who was president there.
Charles Norton Eliot.
Yeah, who had come into
president of Harvard.
who had come into the presidency in the late 1860s with an idea of transforming American education, and the direction that he wanted to go in was towards specialization, and that required a complete overhaul of the curricula. Which has happened all across the country. The curriculum at Harvard was to be specialized, and it was to be specialized toward a perfection of the individual, not the person, in a service to what amounted to a machinery.
As a worker.
Yeah, that's right. The machinery of
not
government.
As a person capable
Right.
of leisure,
Right.
contemplation, prayer.
And so young Eliot, who wanted to be a philosopher and studied philosophy until he discovered that his proper calling was that of the poet, in that Harvard environment discovers himself severely a skeptic. And he begins to react against all sorts of people, including his distant cousin there. But at any rate, I tune into Eliot and find analogies to problems I had along my own way.
But are the problems
about
are the problems that Eliot faced still the problems we're facing?
I think they're the problems we always face, Dio. We face them when we wake up, when we become self-aware. And the question then becomes, am I sufficient through my awareness of myself to my own rescue out of these circumstances in which I find myself? And of course, the modernist temple that leads to the religion of positivism, finally, is that yes, you are sufficient to your own rescue, so long as you concentrate upon your intellect as autonomous and the will as sufficient to you.
And where does God enter in?
Not at all in this direction. And you see, that's why I sort of take as a touchstone 1909. And see, Eliot is trying to write proof rock. And what is proof rock? He can't bring it to completion. Proof rock is not a love song, it's a self-love song. And in it, Eliot is honest enough so that in dramatizing it, he discovers that self-love is not sufficient. Now, it takes him a while to realize that he's made that discovery, and in fact, it's difficult for him to complete that poem. He's working on it in 1909, 1911, just as President Eliot is retiring from his presidency. And Eliot is there as an undergraduate. His cousin is lecturing to the summer school of theology there at Harvard. This was in the summer of 1909, and his topic was the new religion. And I've mentioned this to you, and I don't want to misrepresent him. So if I may, I want to read a couple of his tenets that he argued in this lecture, and you'll see why it could be confusing to such a lively young intellect as Eliot's. Here is Charles Eliot. He says, this religion of the future will deal in no personifications of the primitive forces of nature. That's all out. And of course, Eliot finally comes to the necessity of myth to poetry a little later, and he doesn't quite understand the depths of the mystery of myth. No personifications, no worship express or implied of dead ancestors, teachers, or rulers. It is not based on authority, spiritual or temporal. You see, this is the religion of the future. Its object will not be the personal welfare or safety of the individual in this world or the other. And of course, where in the world is that going to leave the individual if there's nothing of his own welfare at issue in this world or the other. The only responsibility is service to others for the common good. And when anybody says that they're doing something for the common good, beware. As my old grandfather used to say, that's when you reach to your hip pocket and make sure your wallet is still there.
Well, T.S. Eliot rejected this, didn't he?
Oh, of course he did. But here's the final one, and what this final argument does is show that the real enemy is Christianity for Eliot. There will be this new religion will not be propitiatory, sacrificial, or expiatory.
So there's no redemption.
There's no
He sounds
redemption.
like Hayes Moats
He,
in Wise
very
Blood.
much. He wants the new Church of Christ without Christ. You see. And Flannery tuned into this as Eliot gradually tuned into it. You say. Now he couldn't. He was dealing, as most intellectuals at that time were being forced to deal, with a new myth, which is that creation is mechanistic.
This was
there
Darwin.
is no spark of the spirit available. And at about this time, Henri Bergson comes along and says, no, now let's look at it again. There is a spark in here somewhere. And so Bergson publishes that little book a couple of years after
Creative Evolution.
Creative Evolution. And Eliot says, well, maybe I'd better go listen to that man.
So not only Maritain was influenced by Bergson, but Eliot.
And Vogelin, and well, any number of people, and for very good reason. You see, this makes possible a break in that closing, cementing world of positivistic materialism.
Right.
And it means that some sort of spirit must be at work. And Eliot thought, well, this is the man I want to hear. So he went to Paris to listen. He still hadn't finished Prufrock, and he heard Bergson, and it wasn't quite what he had expected. But he was introduced there to somebody else that really did, I think, affect him. And you'd never guess who it was. Dostoevsky.
Oh, yes.
That's where he encountered Dostoevsky.
Well, I want to hear that story
Okay.
after we break.
Okay.
I'm talking with the sage of Crawford, Georgia, Marion Montgomery, a man whose writings you need to know about, you need to read. We'll be back talking more about T.S. Eliot and his encounter with the Russian novelist Dostoevsky in just a moment. Welcome back. We're talking with Marion Montgomery about T.S. Eliot and what got Eliot reoriented toward the faith.
Well, Dostoevsky struck him a blow, I think, pretty obviously. This is not much talked about, and Eliot himself doesn't talk about it a great deal. But if you look at Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground in relation to the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, what you begin to discover is that there are certainly interesting parallels there. Dostoevsky's little work is at the beginning of that period in his own career where he becomes the important figure dealing with spiritual matters, you know. This is the fellow who is sufficient unto himself. The whole thing is interior, as is Prufrock, you know. And surely Eliot came to understand better that what he was dealing with was a sort of a self-love song. It isn't that he abandons it. Remember that this poem finally is published in Poetry in 1915. It was finished a few years earlier, and it was published because Ezra Pound raised hell with the editor of Poetry, who wanted to publish the fog paragraph of the poem, and Pound wrote back, "No, I will not consent to that, nor will I tell you Eliot's address so that you can badger him about this. Print the whole thing." And of course, it was printed.
Does this self-love song that he's slowly finding his way out of through Dostoevsky, and he'll gradually go on to the wasteland and the four quartets, does it represent the movement of an age, or the...
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
And as you know, one of these unpublished books I've done is a work on the four quartets, which argues that it's a revisiting of his whole career, and what it finally does is make the whole body of Eliot's poetic work comparable, analogous to, but not with extreme parallels, to the Divine Comedy. By the time he gets to the four quartets, he understands, in effect, what has been happening to him all along, and he's dawning to it. In this respect, he's very much like Walker Percy, and the two of them are very unlike Flannery O'Connor. Flannery O'Connor was born knowing, as it were, and both Eliot and Percy had to work their way through this. It gives Flannery O'Connor a certain assurance and sense of authority.
She was only 39, wasn't she, when she died?
Well, I know, but it's a matter of, again, of grace.
Right.
Deal, she saw early.
Yeah.
And Eliot began to discover that some of those people that he didn't like, the Romantics, saw more than he thought they did. He will finally, for instance, after badgering Wordsworth as poet, come back to think very highly of him after Eliot has written Ash Wednesday. But in order to get to Ash Wednesday and to get to the four quartets, not only Dostoevsky, but all sorts of people were involved, and particularly, I think, St. Augustine. The Confessions, of course, crops up in the wasteland. To Carthage then I came, burning, burning, burning. And Eliot is beginning to see his own poetry as a species of self-confessional to a degree that he didn't realize. And he's an interesting person for us to study, particularly those who intend to be poets. Here is the poet working out his position as maker of poems and trying to come to terms with the relation of the personal to that. And Eliot is very...
In his life to the poem.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he's very suspicious of the personal in poetry.
Right.
And for good reason. The literature of this past century is largely an autobiographical literature, with the poet from Joyce and Eliot and Pound trying to determine how to gain a sufficient detachment from the personal that they use, so that the art itself won't be damaged. And
so it speaks to everyone.
Well, I don't know that they want particularly to speak to everyone. There is a kind of an arrogance involved in some of these poets, in Joyce, in Pound, and in the early Eliot in particular, that made them regardless of an audience, as it were. But somebody like Eliot discovers that Thomas has something important to say about that's reassuring to him. That doesn't mean that he has to be arrogant to an audience. St. Thomas, says, put it in Flannery O'Connor's words, you never prove anything with a story. That's what she kept telling people. The correction of the appetitive appetite is not the object of art. And the poet must concentrate, and of course Marion calls this to our attention, the poet must concentrate on the good of the thing he is making.
On the beauty of it.
And not so much on the beauty, I would say. It's almost as if beauty is an accident of grace when you have made the thing true to itself. Mm-hmm. And then, behold, it's beautiful, you see.
Right.
And this is the thing that Maritain helped call to to the poet's attention. It didn't take with somebody like Joyce, for instance, I think. It did with Eliot. Eliot, as a matter of fact, translated some of Maritain, published him in the Criterion.
He wrote a great introduction to Joseph Pieper's book
That's
on
right.
leisure, basics of culture.
That's right.
Yeah.
And what some folks still don't know, and they probably know it less now than they would have 2 decades ago, since Eliot's pretty much out in the academy at the moment, you know. But in the 20s, Eliot had begun not only to read people like St. Augustine, but St. Thomas. He's reading him very heavily. And by the time he comes to write Ash Wednesday, the St. Thomas and St. Augustine are right there, and it's a sort of a late discovery. And I happened to hear you talking about Percy recently, and the same thing happens to Percy. The moviegoer, Percy says he thinks that he thought he was following Kierkegaard through to the French existentialists, and he thinks that Jean-Paul Sartre is the primary inspirator of the moviegoer. And when he's all finished with it, he says, no, it's St. Augustine and Dante. And he didn't know it himself until then. Then he recognizes the parallels in the journey Percy, is making at a personal level through the art that he's making, you see. And he can make it. It can free him, because he is not. He doesn't fall into that romantic trap of trying to make art itself the mechanism to transcendence. The artist and the scientist get into this controversy out of the 18th century.
Did Eliot himself have to go through a religious conversion?
Well, he had just before the Wasteland, he had, and during it actually, he had what was then called a nervous breakdown.
Okay.
And what he came to see was that it was a spiritual crisis. You see, a nervous breakdown, we're still safe, because that means we are mechanisms of some sort.
Right.
And all you have to do is find the adjustment.
Right.
You say,
Yeah.
you can make the little adjustments. And of course, Percy again is fascinated with exactly this sort of reading of man, and seeing that it's
throughout his book.
that it's inadequate to the question. Eliot thought that he could, by a severe skepticism, a detachment. And see, this is the romantic in him, you see, that he could separate himself from these problems and control them. And that's why he wants to control the personal in his own art. He wants to use it. That's why he tends to control myth as a device, but he ends up being used by myth. And of course, Flannery O'Connor tuned into this, I think, very early. You remember that passage in the at the turning point of the Wasteland, where the drowned Phoenician is declared to have been once as strong and beautiful as you or I, you know. Well, she has Hayes Moat's encounter exactly this, and where in Atlanta, which she calls Talkingham very appropriately, at the center of a zoo museum in a glass cage, the mummy.
Right.
And of course, her semi-idiot, her simpleton, who's wiser than being mere simpleton, leads old Hayes Moats there, and Hayes leans over the glass case and looks at this mummy, and it's the final blow. What does he see? He sees that mummy, but he sees it through the reflection of himself on the glass case, you see. And that's what gives the coup de grace to his Church of Christ without Christ that he's trying to.
What's the coup de grace in Eliot?
I think it's a gradual thing, so that he woke up realizing the insufficiency of his highly trained intellect to his own rescue. Now it becomes cumulative and leads to that breakdown, which was a spiritual crisis, out of which he slowly emerges. And his good friend Ezra Pound, this is a marvelous relationship between them. It's sort of like the relationship, I think, between Shelby Foote and Walker Percy. Ezra Pound sees which way Eliot is going, and he doesn't like it. Ezra Pound was going to be the Dante of our age, but a secular Dante is what it amounts to. And so Ezra Pound begins to refer to Eliot as Parson Eliot, you see, after the wasteland. So he's making his way out of that very severe spiritual crisis.
And of course, he ends up leaving us some of the most powerful Christian poetry,
I think so,
of our time.
It has been popular. It was in the Academy before they finally ousted Eliot pretty much from the curriculum. It was popular to denigrate the quartets, but I think they're right important. I think it's a kind of a spiritual confession that Eliot engages in finally in those, and it's the sort of engagement that we see recapitulated in somebody like Walker Percy. The Thanatos syndrome and Eliot's late poetry have some striking parallels. Perhaps I think parallels that maybe Percy himself didn't recognize, the way he didn't recognize the presence to him of Dante and St. Augustine when he was writing The Moviegoer.
We've got 1 minute left, Marion. Are poets ultimately more important than philosophers?
I think that's a futile question.
A futile question or a futile question?
Both. It sounds like late scholasticism.
Okay, well, guilty.
And Gilson is good at pointing out that late scholasticism gets us off the track.
Okay.
But this is worth talking about.
Okay, well, we're going to talk about it in our next conversation.
Okay.
Join us again. We'll be talking with Marion Montgomery, a hillbilly Thomist. Thanks for being here. We'll see you that next time.